Before the mid-2nd millennium BC, the populations ancestral to later Iranian-speaking peoples were part of a broader Indo-Iranian linguistic and cultural continuum extending across Central Asia and adjoining steppe zones. These communities did not yet form a single ethnic, political, or religious unit. They consisted of groups with shared language roots and inherited traditions, living across a wide ecological range that included grasslands, river valleys, and semi-arid zones. Economic life was mixed. Pastoral herding dominated in many areas, particularly cattle, sheep, and horses, while some groups practiced limited agriculture and seasonal settlement. Political organization was local, temporary, and personal rather than institutional. Archaeologically, this world is associated with several Bronze Age cultural horizons rather than a single defining culture. The Andronovo horizon, dating broadly from the late 3rd to early 2nd millennium BC, is relevant as one context for early Indo-Iranian language and social patterns, but it does not represent Iranian identity itself. Iranian-speaking groups would only emerge more clearly later, through gradual population movements and cultural differentiation. Other regional traditions across Central Asia and the northern Iranian plateau also contributed to the formation of later Iranian societies. No single archaeological culture can be equated directly with a fully formed religious system. Religious life in this period was embedded in everyday social practice rather than organized through institutions. There were no temples in the later sense, no sacred texts, and no centralized authority defining belief. Religious knowledge was transmitted orally and preserved through ritual performance. Communities maintained relationships with multiple divine beings associated with natural forces, social stability, fertility, and protection. These deities were not arranged into a single theological system, but functioned within inherited patterns of ritual obligation. A central assumption of this religious world was that the cosmos operated according to an underlying order. This order governed the relationship between humans, the natural environment, and the divine realm. It was not articulated as an ethical law governing individual choice in a universal sense. Instead, it functioned as a practical principle. Correct ritual action sustained balance, while incorrect action threatened disorder. Maintaining this balance was a collective responsibility, not an individual moral project. Ritual sacrifice was a primary means of maintaining cosmic and social order. Animal sacrifice, particularly involving cattle, played a significant role. Cattle were economically valuable, socially significant, and ritually potent. Sacrifice functioned as a reciprocal exchange rather than a moral test, offering sustained relationships with divine powers and reinforced social cohesion within the community. There is no evidence from this period for systematic opposition to sacrifice as such. Fire played an important but clearly defined role in ritual life. Fire functioned as a ritual medium through which offerings were prepared, purity was maintained, and ceremonial actions were carried out. It was valued for its transformative capacity and its role in sustaining ritual order. Fire itself was not treated as a deity. Its significance lay in mediation, not worship. This ritual use of fire predates Zoroastrianism and reflects a wider Indo-Iranian pattern rather than a distinct religious doctrine. Religious specialists existed, but their authority was limited and local. These individuals were responsible for conducting rituals, reciting inherited hymns, and maintaining ritual knowledge. Their status depended on skill, memory, and recognition within the community rather than institutional rank or centralized control. There was no hereditary priestly class operating across regions, and no mechanism for enforcing uniform practice. Variation between communities was normal. Concepts of right and wrong existed, but they were framed in terms of social obligation and ritual consequence rather than abstract ethics. Actions were judged according to whether they upheld communal stability, honored ancestral custom, and avoided offense to divine powers. There was no developed framework of universal moral responsibility or individualized judgment extending beyond the immediate social order. Ethical reflection remained secondary to ritual performance and social cohesion. Social organization reinforced these patterns. Kinship networks structured economic production, marriage, inheritance, and conflict resolution. Leadership was exercised by elders or warriors whose authority rested on reputation, negotiation, and temporary consensus. Warfare occurred between groups, often over access to pasture land or resources. Rituals accompanied such conflicts, reinforcing group identity rather than articulating moral universals. Geographically, Indo-Iranian groups occupied zones linking Central Asia, the Iranian Plateau, and regions adjacent to Mesopotamia. This position exposed them to influences from settled agricultural societies while preserving steppe traditions. Movement into the Iranian plateau occurred gradually over centuries, involving adaptation to new environments and interaction with existing populations. These movements were not single events, but long-term processes that reshaped language, economy, and social organization. This inherited religious system was conservative in structure. Authority lay in tradition rather than critique. Ritual correctness mattered more than the evaluation of ritual purpose. Differences in practice did not provoke doctrinal conflict because no standard of orthodoxy existed. Religious tradition functioned to preserve continuity rather than to reform itself. These characteristics define the historical conditions preceding Zoroastrianism. The importance of sacrifice, the ritual use of fire, and the concern for cosmic order all predate later Zoroastrian doctrine. At the same time, this system lacked mechanisms for ethical evaluation beyond ritual and custom. There was no centralized authority capable of redefining belief, and no theological framework that elevated individual choice as a cosmic principle. By the mid-2nd millennium BC, Indo-Iranian religious culture had diversified across regions while retaining a shared inherited vocabulary and ritual logic. Communities expressed this heritage in different ways, but they operated within the same underlying assumptions. It is within this world, characterized by ritual obligation, decentralized authority, and inherited practice, that a reformist message could emerge. Sometime between the mid-2nd and the early 1st millennium BC, a reformist religious voice associated with the figure later known as Zarathustra becomes historically visible through language rather than through biography. No contemporary external records identify him, and no archaeological evidence can be securely linked to his life. What can be examined with confidence are the texts attributed to him, the Gathas, whose linguistic features provide the primary basis for chronological placement. The Gathas are composed in an early form of Avestan that is closely related to early Vedic Sanskrit. Comparative linguistics places this language stage well before the formation of the Achaemenid Empire and before the stabilization of Old Persian. This evidence supports a broad date range extending from the mid-2nd to the early first millennium BC. The dating is probabilistic rather than exact. It rests on language comparison, not on historical records, and alternative scholarly placements exist within this span. What is agreed internationally is that the Gathas represent one of the oldest recoverable bodies of religious poetry in the Iranian world. The content of the Gathas indicates that Zarathustra operates from within the inherited Indo-Iranian religious system rather than outside it. The hymns presuppose ritual specialists, sacrificial practices, and a cosmological framework already familiar to their audience. The reform articulated in these texts is therefore internal and critical, not external or revolutionary in a political sense. It addresses existing religious assumptions and practices and reorders their significance. At the center of the Gathic teaching is Ahura Mazda, presented as the supreme source of wisdom and order. This formulation does not deny the existence of other divine beings known from Indo-Iranian tradition, but it places them within a restructured hierarchy. Authority in the divine realm is no longer distributed primarily according to ritual function or inherited status. Instead, it is defined by alignment with truth and order. This reconfiguration marks a conceptual shift from earlier polytheistic patterns without yet establishing a fully exclusive monotheism. The organizing principle of this system is Asha. In the pre-Zoroastrian, cosmic order functioned mainly as a ritual principle maintained through correct performance. In the Gathas, Asha becomes a comprehensive standard governing thought, speech, and action. This does not eliminate ritual, but it subordinates ritual correctness to alignment with truth. Correct action is evaluated not only by form, but by its relation to order and understanding. Opposed to Asha is Druj, representing falsehood, deception, and disorder. The opposition between these two principles introduces an ethical dualism grounded in cognition and choice. It is critical to distinguish this from later metaphysical or cosmic dualism. In the Gathas, the opposition is not between two equal supernatural forces competing for control of the universe. It is between truthful and deceptive ways of thinking and acting, with human choice occupying a central role. Later Zoroastrian doctrines that describe a fully developed cosmic struggle cannot be reconstructed from the Gathas alone. The Gathic critique of inherited religious practice focuses particularly on ritual behavior that operates independently of ethical evaluation. The hymns express opposition to certain sacrificial practices, especially those involving violence against cattle, when such practices are carried out without regard for truth or justice. This critique targets ritual detached from moral alignment rather than ritual as a category. The Gathas do not propose the elimination of ritual activity. They redefine its legitimacy. Ritual practice becomes acceptable only insofar as it supports Asha. This position directly challenges the authority of existing ritual specialists. In the Indo-Iranian, religious authority rests on inherited knowledge and ritual competence. In the Gathic framework, authority is conditional. It depends on understanding, truthful speech, and ethical alignment. Knowledge is no longer transmitted automatically through participation in ritual, but must be consciously adopted and maintained. This represents a shift in how religious legitimacy is defined. Human responsibility is central to this redefinition. The Gathas portray human beings as capable of informed choice. Individuals are addressed directly and held responsible for aligning themselves with truth or falsehood. This does not amount to a developed doctrine of judgment, or afterlife in later theological terms, but it establishes a new structure of accountability. Cosmic order is no longer maintained solely through collective ritual action. It is affected by individual decisions. The social and economic background implied by the Gathas is consistent with a pastoral or semi-pastoral environment. References to cattle, herding, and resource conflict correspond to conditions typical of early Iranian societies prior to large-scale state formation. The critique of violent sacrifice can be understood within this context, where cattle are both economically vital and ritually significant. The Gathic position does not arise in abstraction. It engages directly with the material realities of its audience. Geographically, the Gathas provide no explicit place names that allow precise localization. Linguistic and cultural indicators suggest an Eastern Iranian or Central Asian setting rather than Western Iran, but this remains an inference rather than a conclusion. The relevant frame is not modern geography, but the Eastern Iranian cultural zone that existed before imperial consolidation. What can be stated securely is that the Gathic tradition predates Iranian political unification and develops in a context without imperial institutions. The mode of transmission during this period is entirely oral. The Gathas are composed for recitation and memorization, not for written preservation. This method of transmission allows for stability of core concepts alongside variation in performance and emphasis. There is no canon in this period, no fixed liturgy, and no centralized authority capable of enforcing uniform interpretation. Early Zoroastrianism, therefore, exists alongside older Indo-Iranian practices rather than displacing them. The scale of early Zoroastrian influence appears limited. The Gathas do not reflect widespread acceptance or institutional success. They address a small community operating within a broader religious environment that continues to follow inherited practices. There is no evidence at this stage for state sponsorship, legal authority, or organized expansion. The movement remains localized and contested. What distinguishes this phase is not immediate impact, but structural innovation. The Gathic teaching reorganizes the relationship between ritual, knowledge, and responsibility. Cosmic order becomes an ethical standard. Ritual authority becomes conditional. Human choice becomes consequential. These elements do not yet form a complete religious system, but they establish a framework capable of later development under different historical conditions. By the early 1st millennium BC, the ideas articulated in the Gathas circulated among Iranian-speaking communities through oral transmission. They coexist with older traditions, producing variation rather than uniformity. The absence of centralized authority ensures that interpretation and practice differ from region to region. This pattern of decentralized transmission and adaptation defines the next stage of Zoroastrian history. During the centuries following the composition of the Gathas, in the early 1st millennium BC, the teachings associated with Zarathustra entered a phase defined by transmission without institutions. Zoroastrianism at this stage does not exist as a bounded religion with fixed texts, offices, or legal authority. It exists as a set of ideas, ritual priorities, and ethical orientations circulating among Iranian-speaking communities through oral means. This form of transmission reflects the social and political conditions of the time rather than a deliberate choice to avoid organization. The primary mechanism of preservation is oral recitation. The Gathas are composed in a poetic form suited to memorization, but oral transmission does not imply exact verbal stability. Over decades and centuries, variation in wording, structure, and emphasis is normal. Core concepts, such as the authority of Ahura Mazda, the centrality of Asha, and the opposition to Derye, remain recognizable, but their expression adapts to local linguistic habits and ritual contexts. There is no fixed reference text against which accuracy can be measured, and therefore no concept of textual deviation or corruption in the latter sense. Zoroastrian ideas circulate along existing social networks. Transmission occurs within families, clans, and small ritual communities rather than through organized teaching or missionary activity. These networks are shaped by kinship ties, patterns of seasonal movement, and local leadership structures. The spread of teaching is uneven and gradual, following the same routes as trade, intermarriage, and migration. There is no evidence for centralized coordination of religious instruction across regions. Throughout this period, Zoroastrian teachings coexist with inherited Indo-Iranian practices rather than replacing them. Communities that adopt Gathic ideas continue to participate in established rituals, including animal sacrifice, communal feasting, and seasonal ceremonies. Ritual specialists remain active, performing functions inherited from earlier traditions. What changes is not the immediate abandonment of ritual, but the interpretive framework through which ritual is evaluated. In some communities, ethical alignment with Asha becomes a criterion for assessing ritual legitimacy. In others, ethical language is incorporated into existing practice without substantial alteration of ritual form. There is no centralized priesthood in this period, and later Zoroastrian priestly offices cannot be projected backward into it. Religious specialists operate locally, without standardized titles, ranks, or training systems extending across regions. Authority depends on ritual competence, memory, and social recognition rather than institutional position. Differences in practice and interpretation are not adjudicated by any higher body. They persist without being labeled as error or deviation. Political organization reinforces this decentralization. Iranian-speaking societies of the early 1st millennium BC are fragmented, with authority exercised by local leaders, tribal confederations, or temporary coalitions. There is no state apparatus capable of sponsoring, regulating, or enforcing religious norms on a large scale. Economic life remains mixed, combining pastoralism, agriculture, and regional exchange, with limited urban development. These conditions do not support religious standardization. Geographically, Iranian-speaking populations occupy a wide and discontinuous space extending from Central Asia into the Iranian plateau. Communication across this landscape is slow and irregular. Travel occurs along seasonal routes and established corridors rather than along permanent administrative networks. As a result, religious ideas develop regional characteristics shaped by environment, language, and local tradition. Zoroastrianism during this phase is better understood as a family of related practices than as a single uniform system. Alongside the Gathic material, other religious compositions circulate during this period. Hymns, prayers, and ritual formulas reflecting broader Indo-Iranian mythological themes continue to be used. These materials do not necessarily conflict with Gathic teaching, but they expand the religious repertoire beyond the ethical focus of the Gathis. At this stage, there is no agreed hierarchy among texts or traditions. The distinction between older and newer material remains fluid and situational. The role of fire remains consistent with earlier practice. Fire continues to function as a ritual medium associated with purity, offering, and recitation. Its use varies by region and context, and there is no evidence in this period for standardized fire temples or a uniform fire-centered cult. Fire's importance persists, but its role does not yet display the institutional characteristics seen in later periods. Diversity during this phase is not experienced as fragmentation. In the absence of a concept of orthodoxy, variation does not imply division. Religious life remains oriented toward maintaining social cohesion and ritual continuity. Gathic ideas function as interpretive principles rather than boundary markers separating communities into distinct groups. Individuals and communities participate simultaneously in inherited practices and emerging ethical frameworks. By the middle centuries of the first millennium BC, Zoroastrian teachings were widely known across Iranian-speaking regions, but they still lacked formal structure. There are no dedicated religious buildings, no standardized liturgy, and no fixed calendar binding communities together. The religion exists as a decentralized tradition sustained by memory, performance, and local authority. This phase is decisive for later history. The flexibility produced by oral transmission and regional adaptation allows Zoroastrianism to persist across centuries without political support. At the same time, the absence of standardization ensures that later encounters with political power will involve selection, consolidation, and redefinition rather than simple continuity. Several centuries still separate this period from the emergence of imperial structures on the Iranian plateau. Zoroastrianism at this stage remains embedded within a plural religious environment, shaped by local conditions and inherited practices. As the first millennium BC advances, Iranian-speaking societies undergo gradual social and political consolidation across the Iranian plateau and adjacent regions. This process does not produce immediate state structures, but it alters the conditions under which religious traditions circulate and stabilize. Zoroastrian ideas, transmitted orally and shaped by regional practice, begin to acquire greater visibility within these evolving societies, though they remain neither exclusive nor institutionally enforced. During this period, patterns of settlement shift. Pastoralism continues to play a major role, but mixed economies combining herding, agriculture, and regional exchange become more common. Communities grow larger and more permanent, particularly in fertile valleys and along trade corridors connecting Central Asia, the Plateau, and Mesopotamia. These changes support more durable forms of leadership and more regularized ritual life, without yet producing centralized states. Political authority remains fragmented. Power is exercised by local rulers, clan leaders, and regional elites whose authority depends on lineage, military capacity, and negotiated loyalty. No overarching imperial administration exists. Religious authority mirrors this structure. There is still no centralized priesthood, no codified law, and no institution capable of defining or enforcing religious orthodoxy across regions. Zoroastrian traditions operate within this decentralized framework. Within these conditions, Zoroastrian ideas increasingly shape how religious practice is interpreted, even when older rituals continue. Ethical concepts derived from the Gathic tradition, especially the emphasis on truth, order, and responsible action, are applied to existing ceremonial life rather than replacing it outright. Sacrificial practices persist, but their legitimacy is more often discussed in terms of alignment with order and justice rather than ritual form alone. This development reflects adaptation rather than rupture. The role of fire remains consistent with earlier phases. Fire continues to function as a ritual medium associated with purity, offering, and recitation. Its use becomes more regular in certain communities, particularly those where Zoroastrian ethical concepts are emphasized, but there is no evidence for standardized fire temples or a uniform fire-centered cult during this period. Practices vary by region, and no centralized authority regulates them. Textual transmission continues to be oral. Alongside the Gathas, other hymns, prayers, and ritual formulas circulate, drawing on a wider Indo-Iranian mythological heritage. These materials are not organized into a canon, and their relative authority differs from one community to another. The distinction between Gathic and non-Gathic material is not yet fixed. Religious knowledge remains situational, shaped by local memory and performance. Geographically, Zoroastrian traditions are present across a wide area, but unevenly. Eastern Iranian and Central Asian regions continue to play a significant role in preserving and transmitting early forms of the tradition, while Western areas of the plateau exhibit greater interaction with older local cults and neighboring religious systems. This uneven distribution reflects patterns of migration, communication, and political development rather than doctrinal preference. Contacts with neighboring cultures increase during this period. Iranian-speaking groups interact with Mesopotamian, Anatolian, and Levantine societies through trade and conflict. These interactions introduce new administrative practices, artistic forms, and religious ideas, but there is no evidence that they displace Zoroastrian traditions. Instead, religious life remains plural, with Zoroastrian concepts operating alongside other local and regional practices. Authority structures within religious life remain personal and local. Religious specialists derive legitimacy from lineage, ritual competence, and social recognition rather than from appointment or standardized training. Disputes over practice or interpretation are resolved within communities, if at all. There is no institutional mechanism for defining deviation or enforcing uniformity. Diversity continues to be a normal feature of religious life. The absence of centralized enforcement allows Zoroastrian traditions to remain flexible. This flexibility contributes to their persistence across changing social conditions. At the same time, it limits their capacity to define a unified religious identity across the Iranian world. Zoroastrianism during this phase is best understood as a constellation of related practices and ideas rather than a single, bounded religion. By the later centuries of this period, the groundwork was laid for a new phase of interaction between religion and power. Emerging political entities begin to consolidate territory and authority on a larger scale. Religious traditions that can articulate order, legitimacy, and moral responsibility are increasingly relevant to these developments. Zoroastrian ideas, already embedded within Iranian cultural life, are positioned to be taken up by ruling elites, though this process is not yet formalized. Several generations still separate this pre-imperial phase from the establishment of the empire. Zoroastrianism remains decentralized, orally transmitted, and regionally varied. Its concepts influence practice and interpretation without being codified into law or enforced through institutions. With the rise of the Achaemenid dynasty in the mid-6th century BC, Iranian-speaking societies entered a new historical phase defined by large-scale political unification. This transformation does not originate in religious reform, but in military expansion, administrative consolidation, and imperial governance. For the first time, Iranian traditions, religious, linguistic, and cultural, are articulated within the framework of a vast empire extending from the Indus Valley and Central Asia to Anatolia, the Levant, and Egypt. Zoroastrian traditions, previously decentralized and transmitted orally, now operate within an imperial context, though they do not yet take institutional or canonical form. The Achaemenid Empire began with Cyrus II, later known as Cyrus the Great, whose conquest between approximately 550 and 530 BC brought together diverse populations under a single political authority. Cyrus' rule is characterized by pragmatic governance rather than ideological uniformity. Administrative documents and royal proclamations emphasize loyalty, order, and stability, but they do not articulate a detailed theological system. Religious life across the empire remains plural, shaped by local customs and long-established traditions. The clearest evidence for the religious orientation of the Achaemenid ruling house appears in royal inscriptions, particularly those of Darius I and his successors. These inscriptions consistently invoke Ahura Mazda as the supreme deity who grants kingship, victory, and order. The Behistun inscription, composed during the reign of Darius I in the late 6th century BC, provides the most extensive example. In it, Darius attributes his legitimacy and success to the favor of Ahura Mazda and frames rebellion and disorder as violations of proper order. This invocation of Ahura Mazda marks a significant moment in Iranian religious history. It demonstrates that concepts central to Zoroastrian tradition, divine wisdom, order, and truth, have entered the language of imperial authority. However, it is essential to distinguish this royal ideology from later institutional Zoroastrianism. The inscriptions do not reference the Gathic, Zarathustra, or a defined religious law. They do not describe a priestly hierarchy, prescribe ritual practice, or define orthodoxy. The religion of the Achaemenid court is best described as Mazdean rather than fully Zoroastrian in the later sense. The political structure of the empire shapes this religious posture. Achaemenid administration is organized through satrapies, each governed by officials responsible for taxation, military security, and local order. This system relies on cooperation with local elites and respect for established customs. Religious uniformity is neither practical nor pursued. Temples dedicated to local deities continue to function across the empire, from Babylonian sanctuaries to Egyptian cult centers. Royal patronage does not require religious conversion or doctrinal conformity. Within this plural environment, Zoroastrian traditions do not operate as an exclusive state religion. There is no evidence for empire-wide enforcement of Mazdean worship, no suppression of other cults, and no centralized religious authority linked directly to the throne. The absence of a canon and priestly hierarchy. Oral transmission remains dominant, and regional variation persists. The role of religious specialists during the Achaemenid period remains difficult to reconstruct in detail. Later Greek sources refer to magi, a group associated with ritual expertise, divination, and religious instruction. These references, however, are external observations and must be treated cautiously. The Magi do not appear in Achaemenid inscriptions as an institutionalized priesthood governing the empire's religious life. Their functions appear local and specialized rather than centralized or uniform. Ritual practices associated with Iranian tradition continued during this period, including sacrifice, prayer, and the use of fire as a ritual medium. Archaeological and textual evidence suggests continuity rather than abrupt change. There is no indication of standardized fire temples or a uniform ritual calendar imposed by the state. Practices differ across regions, reflecting local traditions and inherited patterns rather than imperial regulation. Ethical concepts associated with the Zoroastrian tradition find expression in royal ideology, particularly in the emphasis on order and opposition to deceit. Darius I presents himself as a king who upholds truth and suppresses rebellion framed as falsehood. This language parallels Gathic concepts such as Asha and Druj, but it is adapted to the needs of imperial governance rather than religious instruction. The ethical framework functions as political rhetoric, legitimizing authority and framing resistance as disorder. It is important to avoid projecting later developments backward onto this period. The Achaemenid Empire did not produce a fixed Avesta, a codified religious law, or a centralized Zoroastrian institution. There is no evidence for systematic theological debate or formal exclusion of alternative interpretations. Zoroastrianism remains one tradition among many within the imperial religious landscape. Geographically, the empire's vast reach contributes to the further diffusion of Iranian religious concepts. Administrative networks, military movements, and trade routes facilitate contact between Iranian-speaking elites and non-Iranian populations. This contact does not result in uniform religious conversion, but it increases the visibility of Mazdean ideas beyond their earlier regional confines. At the same time, Iranian traditions absorb influences from neighboring cultures, reinforcing their adaptive character. The collapse of the Achaemenid Empire following the campaigns of Alexander of Macedon in the late 4th century BC does not mark the end of Iranian religious life, but it disrupts the political framework within which Mazdean royal ideology operated. The loss of imperial patronage removes a key source of prestige and stability. Religious traditions that had functioned alongside imperial authority must now adapt to new conditions. By the end of the Achaemenid period, Zoroastrianism had not yet become an institutionalized state religion. Its concepts have influenced imperial ideology, but its structures remain decentralized and oral. The period establishes a critical precedent: the association between Iranian rulership and the invocation of Ahura Mazda. This association will later be reinterpreted and expanded under different political regimes. The significance of the Achaemenid period lies in this limited but consequential interaction between religion and power. Zoroastrian traditions are neither absorbed into a rigid state system nor marginalized. They exist in a space shaped by imperial authority without being defined by it. This outcome preserves diversity while introducing new possibilities for future development. The fall of the Achaemenid Empire ushers in a phase of political fragmentation and cultural transition. Iranian religious traditions, including those shaped by Gathic teaching and Mazdean royal ideology, enter a period of adjustment under foreign rule. The collapse of the Achaemenid Empire at the end of the 4th century BC marks a decisive political rupture for Iranian societies, but it does not represent a religious extinction or abrupt transformation. Instead, The period from roughly 330 to 247 BC is characterized by disruption, fragmentation, and reconfiguration. Zoroastrian traditions, which had operated alongside imperial authority without becoming a centralized state religion, now lost the indirect prestige and stability provided by Achaemenid rule. What follows is a prolonged transitional phase shaped by foreign domination, administrative change, and regional adaptation. Alexander of Macedon's campaigns against the Achaemenid Empire, beginning in the 330s BC, dismantled the imperial structures that had unified much of the Iranian world. Key administrative centers are captured, royal authority is eliminated, and existing systems of governance are replaced or repurposed. The Achaemenid ruling house disappears, and with it the royal ideology that linked kingship to the favor of Ahura Mazda. This loss does not target religious practice directly, but it removes the political framework within which Mazdian concepts had been publicly articulated at the highest level. Alexander's own approach to religion is pragmatic. In many regions, he supports existing cults and adopts local ritual practices to secure legitimacy. In Iranian territories, there is no evidence of systematic suppression of Iranian religious traditions. At the same time, there is no effort to preserve or promote them as imperial ideology. Religious life becomes detached from centralized power and returns fully to local and regional contexts. After Alexander died in 323 BC, his empire fragmented rapidly. Control over Iranian territories passes to the Seleucid dynasty, whose rulers governed from centers in Mesopotamia and the eastern Mediterranean. The Seleucid state introduced administrative practices, urban planning, and cultural forms associated with the Hellenistic world. Greek becomes the dominant language of administration and elite culture in many cities, while Iranian languages continue to be spoken in rural and tribal settings. This political and cultural shift alters the conditions under which Zoroastrian traditions operate. The Seleucid rulers do not adopt Mazdian ideology as a source of legitimacy. Their authority is expressed through Hellenistic kingship, civic institutions, and Greek religious symbolism. As a result, Zoroastrian traditions lose visibility at the level of state representation. They persist, but they do so without official patronage and without a role in imperial rhetoric. The impact of this change is uneven across regions. In urban centers founded or expanded under Seleucid rule, Greek religious practices, temples, and festivals became prominent. In rural areas and among Iranian-speaking populations, older traditions continue with less interference. This divergence reinforces the decentralization already present in earlier periods. Zoroastrian practice becomes increasingly associated with local communities rather than with overarching political structures. The loss of imperial administration also affects religious transmission. Without centralized courts or administrative networks linking Iranian elites, communication between regions becomes less regular. Oral transmission remains dominant, but regional variation increases. Differences in ritual emphasis, terminology, and mythological content become more pronounced. This process does not produce doctrinal conflict, because there is still no institutional mechanism for defining orthodoxy or deviation. Later Zoroastrian tradition preserves accounts of destruction and loss during this period, particularly the claim that sacred texts were damaged or destroyed during Alexander's conquests. These accounts, preserved in much later sources, cannot be verified directly and should not be treated as contemporary historical reporting. What can be stated with confidence is that the absence of written canon and centralized preservation mechanisms makes the tradition vulnerable to disruption. Oral transmission allows survival, but it does not guarantee uniformity or completeness. Religious specialists continue to function at the local level. The figures later known collectively as magi appear in Greek sources of the Hellenistic period as ritual experts, diviners, and interpreters of dreams and omens. These descriptions reflect Greek perceptions rather than internal Iranian classifications, and they should not be read as evidence of a unified Zoroastrian priesthood. Their activities appear diverse and context-dependent, serving courts, communities, or individuals rather than a centralized institution. Ritual practices associated with the Iranian religion persist throughout this period. Sacrifice, prayer, purification, and the ritual use of fire continue in various forms. There is no evidence for standardized fire temples or empire-wide religious architecture imposed by the Seleucid state. Practices vary by region, reflecting inherited traditions and local adaptation rather than centralized regulation. The ethical concepts articulated in earlier Zoroastrian tradition do not disappear, but their public expression becomes less prominent. Without royal inscriptions or imperial ideology invoking Ahura Mazda, these concepts operate primarily within community contexts. Ethical language remains embedded in ritual and social norms rather than articulated as a political framework. The broader cultural environment of the Hellenistic period introduces new influences. Iranian populations encounter Greek philosophy, art, and religious ideas through urban centers and administrative structures. This contact does not result in the replacement of Iranian religious traditions, but it contributes to a more complex cultural landscape. Religious life becomes plural at multiple levels, combining Iranian, Greek, Mesopotamian, and local elements. The political weakness of the Seleucid state in eastern territories further shapes this period. Distance from the imperial center, combined with ongoing conflicts, limits the reach of centralized authority. Local rulers, tribal leaders, and regional elites gain greater autonomy. This decentralization allows Iranian traditions to persist with relatively little interference, even as they remain excluded from official state ideology. By the mid-3rd century BC, Seleucid control over much of Iran had weakened significantly. In eastern regions, new Iranian dynasties begin to assert independence. Among these, the Arsacid family establishes what will become the Parthian Empire. This transition does not immediately restore centralized Iranian rule, but it marks the beginning of a shift away from Hellenistic dominance. Throughout the period from 330 to 247 BC, Zoroastrian traditions demonstrate resilience through flexibility. They survive without temples, canon, or state support. Their survival depends on community memory, ritual practice, and adaptation to changing political circumstances. This resilience comes at the cost of increasing regional diversity and the absence of standardization. The significance of this period lies not in doctrinal development, but in continuity under disruption. Zoroastrianism neither disappears nor consolidates. It endures as a decentralized tradition shaped by loss of empire, foreign rule, and cultural exchange. The experience of operating without political patronage will later influence how the religion interacts with the new Iranian state. By the time Iranian dynasties began to reassert control in the mid-3rd century BC, Zoroastrian traditions had been transformed by nearly a century of imperial collapse and foreign administration. They are no longer associated with a single royal house or imperial ideology. Instead, they exist as a network of practices embedded in local societies across the Iranian world. With the establishment of Arsacid rule in the mid-3rd century BC, Iranian political authority re-emerged after more than a century of Hellenistic dominance. The Parthian state, founded by Arsaces I and expanded by his successors, restores Iranian dynastic control over large parts of the plateau and surrounding regions. This restoration, however, does not recreate the centralized imperial structures of the Achaemenids. The Parthian Empire develops as a loose confederation of territories governed through negotiated authority, regional autonomy, and aristocratic power. These political conditions shaped the religious landscape decisively. Parthian rule extended over a vast and uneven territory, stretching at different times from Mesopotamia to eastern Iran and Central Asia. Control varies by region and period. Royal authority depends on cooperation with powerful noble families and local rulers rather than on a centralized bureaucracy. The Arsacid kings rule as first among equals within an elite network, not as absolute monarchs supported by uniform administration. This political structure limits the capacity of the state to regulate religious practice or impose ideological conformity. Within this framework, Zoroastrian traditions continue to exist without institutional unification. There is no empire-wide priestly hierarchy, no standardized canon, and no central authority defining correct belief or practice. Religious life remains embedded in local communities, shaped by regional customs, languages, and inherited ritual forms. The Parthian period does not reverse the decentralization that followed the fall of the Achaemenids. It normalizes it. The religious orientation of the Parthian ruling house itself is difficult to define precisely. Parthian coinage, inscriptions, and material culture provide limited evidence of explicit religious ideology. Unlike the Achaemenids, Parthian kings do not consistently invoke Ahura Mazda in official inscriptions. Royal representation emphasizes dynastic legitimacy, lineage, and martial authority rather than theological formulation. This absence does not indicate hostility toward Zoroastrianism, but it reflects the limited role of religion in Parthian state ideology. Zoroastrian practices persist across the Parthian world, but they do so in multiple regional forms. In Mesopotamia, Iranian religious traditions coexist with long-established Babylonian cults and with emerging Jewish and Christian communities. In Western Iran, Zoroastrian practices interact with local traditions shaped by earlier Achaemenid and Hellenistic influence. In eastern regions, closer to Central Asia, older Iranian ritual forms remain more prominent. These regional differences are not coordinated or reconciled by any central authority. Religious specialists continue to operate locally. The figures known to Greek and Roman authors as magi appeared during this period in various contexts, including royal courts and private ritual settings. Classical descriptions portray them as ritual experts, interpreters of signs, and keepers of traditional knowledge. These accounts are external and reflect Greco-Roman categories rather than internal religious organization. They do not provide evidence for a unified or empire-wide Zoroastrian priesthood. Instead, they indicate a range of specialized roles performed in different settings. Ritual practice during the Parthian period remains diverse. Animal sacrifice continues in some regions, while other communities emphasize prayer, purification, and ethical conduct. The ritual use of fire persists, but there is no evidence for standardized fire temples or a uniform cult of fire enforced across the empire. Fire altars appear in some archaeological contexts, but their form and function vary widely. The absence of standardization reflects the broader political and administrative structure of the Parthian state. Textual transmission remains primarily oral. The gathas and other Avestan material continue to be preserved through recitation rather than writing. Additional hymns, prayers, and ritual texts circulate alongside the Gathic core, drawing on a mixture of Iranian mythological themes and local tradition. There is no fixed corpus recognized across regions. The boundaries of what later becomes the Avesta remain fluid, shaped by local usage rather than centralized selection. This period is significant for the accumulation of religious material rather than for doctrinal consolidation. Diverse traditions coexist, overlap, and interact. Some elements that will later be incorporated into standardized Zoroastrian theology likely take shape during this time, but they do so without formal definition. The lack of centralized authority allows religious creativity and adaptation, but it also prevents the establishment of uniform teaching. The broader religious environment of the Parthian world is increasingly complex. Iranian populations interact with Greek religious traditions inherited from the Hellenistic period, Mesopotamian cults with deep historical roots, and emerging religious movements such as Judaism and Christianity. These interactions do not result in the disappearance of Zoroastrian traditions, but they contribute to a pluralistic landscape in which no single religious system dominates across all regions. Parthian political instability further reinforces religious decentralization. Succession disputes, internal revolts, and conflicts with external powers, most notably Rome, limit the capacity of the state to project authority consistently. Frontier regions experience frequent shifts in control. In this environment, religious life remains a local matter, sustained by community structures rather than by state institutions. Despite this decentralization, Zoroastrian traditions continue to function as a marker of Iranian cultural identity in some contexts. Among Iranian elites, inherited ritual practices and ethical concepts provide continuity with the pre-Hellenistic past. This continuity is cultural rather than institutional. It does not produce a unified religious identity across the empire, but it maintains a shared repertoire of symbols, narratives, and practices. By the late Parthian period, the limitations of this decentralized system became increasingly apparent. The absence of standardized religious authority means that Zoroastrian traditions vary widely in content and practice. Local interpretations proliferate, and the relationship between ritual, ethics, and cosmology differs from one region to another. These differences are not yet contested as heresy because no central standard exists against which to measure deviation. At the same time, the persistence of Zoroastrian traditions across centuries of political fragmentation demonstrates their adaptability. The religion survives without temples, canon, or centralized enforcement. It operates through memory, performance, and local authority. This mode of survival preserves continuity but postpones consolidation. The end of the Parthian period brings another political transformation. In the early 3rd century AD, the Arsacid dynasty was overthrown by the Sasanians, a family originating in southwestern Iran. The Sasanian rulers pursue a markedly different approach to governance and religion. They seek to centralize authority, standardize practice, and integrate religious tradition into state structure. This transition marks a turning point. The decentralized Zoroastrianisms of the Parthian period provide the raw material for later institutionalization. The diversity preserved under Arzacid rule becomes the object of selection, regulation, and codification under Sasanian authority. The overthrow of the Arzacid dynasty in the early 3rd century AD marks the most decisive structural turning point in the history of Zoroastrianism. When Ardashir I defeated the last Parthian king and established the Sasanian dynasty, Iranian political authority was not merely restored, it was reorganized. The Sasanian state pursues centralization, uniform administration, and ideological coherence. Religion becomes a key instrument in this project. Zoroastrian traditions that had existed for centuries in decentralized and regionally varied forms are now drawn into a systematic relationship with imperial power. The Sasanians ruled from southwestern Iran, with power centers in Fars and later in Ctesiphon. Their claim to legitimacy is explicitly Iranian and deliberately contrasts with the looser, aristocratic structure of Parthian rule. Kingship is presented as divinely sanctioned, hereditary, and absolute. Within this framework, Zoroastrianism is elevated from a constellation of traditions into the preferred religious system of the state. This transformation does not occur instantly. Early Sasanian rulers promoted Mazdaean worship and Iranian religious identity, but the process of religious centralization unfolded gradually over several generations. Ardashir I and his successor Shapur I support Zoroastrian institutions, patronize priests, and associate royal authority with divine order. Royal inscriptions and rock reliefs emphasize the relationship between kingship, truth, and cosmic order, drawing on concepts long present in Iranian tradition but now articulated within a centralized political framework. For the first time, Zoroastrianism is positioned as a state religion. This does not mean that alternative religions disappear. The Sasanian Empire governs a religiously diverse population that includes Jews, Christians, Manichaeans, and adherents of local cults. However, Zoroastrianism now occupies a privileged legal and ideological position. It is tied to royal legitimacy, law, and social hierarchy in ways that were absent in earlier periods. A defining feature of the Sasanian transformation is the creation of a centralized priestly hierarchy. Religious authority is no longer entirely local. Priests are organized into a ranked structure, with senior figures exercising influence across regions. Titles such as Mobd and Mobidan Mobd appear in later sources, indicating a hierarchy responsible for ritual oversight, legal interpretation, and doctrinal regulation. While the precise early development of this hierarchy is difficult to reconstruct, its existence by the later Sasanian period is well attested. This priestly organization plays a central role in standardizing religious practice. Ritual procedures, purity laws, and ceremonial observances are increasingly regulated. Fire temples become more prominent and more clearly defined as institutional centers. Fire continues to function as a ritual medium rather than an object of worship, but its role is now embedded within formal temple structures supported by the state. Different grades of sacred fire are distinguished, reflecting an emerging systematization of ritual practice. The Sasanian period is also crucial for the textual history of Zoroastrianism. Efforts are made to collect, preserve, and organize sacred material that had previously circulated orally and regionally. This process does not result in a single, fixed canon in the modern sense. Instead, it involves compilation, redaction, and classification over several centuries. Portions of what later becomes known as the Avesta are gathered, while other material is lost or excluded. The resulting corpus reflects both inherited tradition and Sasanian priorities. It is important to emphasize that this textual project is selective and contingent. Later Zoroastrian sources refer to an idealized, complete Avesta that no longer exists, often attributing its loss to earlier periods of disruption. These accounts reflect retrospective memory rather than contemporary documentation. What can be established historically is that the Sasanian state supports a process of textual consolidation that significantly shapes the form of Zoroastrian tradition known from later sources. Doctrinal development accompanies this institutionalization. Concepts that appear in earlier traditions, including ethical dualism, cosmology, and eschatology, are elaborated and systematized. The opposition between order and disorder is increasingly framed in cosmic terms, involving structured hierarchies of divine and demonic beings. This development builds on earlier ideas but extends them beyond what can be reconstructed from the Gathas alone. The Sasanian period is therefore formative for what is often understood as classical Zoroastrian theology. Law becomes another area of integration between religion and state. Zoroastrian legal principles influence matters of marriage, inheritance, property, and social status. Priests participate in legal interpretation, and religious norms shape aspects of civil administration. This fusion of religious and legal authority further distinguishes the Sasanian period from earlier phases, where Zoroastrianism operated without institutional enforcement. At the same time, the relationship between the Sasanian state and religious minorities remains complex and variable. Policies toward Christians, Jews, and other groups fluctuate across reigns, influenced by internal politics and external relations, particularly with the Roman and later Byzantine empires. Periods of tolerance alternate with episodes of restriction or persecution. These policies reflect political calculations rather than a consistent theological program. The Sasanian period also witnessed the emergence of religious movements that challenged established authority. Manichaeism, founded in the 3rd century AD, combines elements drawn from Iranian, Christian, and Buddhist traditions. Its rapid spread and universalist claims provoke opposition from Zoroastrian priests and the state. The suppression of Manichaeism illustrates how centralized religious authority now functions. Deviation is defined, contested, and punished in ways that were not possible in earlier decentralized contexts. Geographically, the Sasanian Empire facilitates greater connectivity across Iranian regions. Administrative networks, roads, and urban centers allow more regular communication between priestly communities. This connectivity supports the spread of standardized practices and interpretations. While regional variation does not disappear, it is increasingly constrained by institutional oversight. Despite these developments, Zoroastrianism under the Sasanians did not become monolithic. Local practices persist, and full uniformity is never achieved. The scale of the empire, combined with its diversity, limits complete standardization. Nonetheless, the contrast with the Parthian period is stark. Where Parthian rule normalized decentralization, Sasanian governance seeks coherence. By the 5th and 6th centuries AD, Zoroastrianism functioned as an integrated component of Sasanian state identity. Kingship, law, ritual, and cosmology are linked within a shared ideological framework. This configuration represents the peak of Zoroastrian institutional power. It is during this period that many features later associated with the religion, formal priesthood, temple networks, and elaborated doctrine, take recognizable shape. This peak, however, is historically contingent. The close alignment between religion and state creates strength, but it also produces vulnerability. Zoroastrian institutions become dependent on imperial structures for authority and enforcement. When those structures weaken, the religion's position is exposed. By the early 7th century AD, the Sasanian Empire faced mounting pressures from prolonged warfare, economic strain, and internal instability. These pressures culminate in the Arab conquests that begin in the 630s AD. The fall of the Sasanian state will mark another fundamental transformation in the history of Zoroastrianism. By the early 7th century AD, the Sasanian Empire stood under sustained pressure. Decades of conflict with the Eastern Roman, Byzantine Empire have exhausted manpower, disrupted agriculture, and strained imperial finances. Repeated campaigns across Mesopotamia, Armenia, and the Levant weaken border defenses and undermine internal stability. These conditions form the background against which a new external force enters the Iranian world. Beginning in the 630s AD, Arab armies expanded beyond the Arabian Peninsula into the territories of the Sasanian state. Initial encounters occur along the southern and western frontiers, particularly in Mesopotamia. The decisive military defeats of Sasanian forces at battles such as Al-Qadisiyah and Nahavan marked the rapid collapse of effective imperial resistance. By 651 AD, the last Sasanian ruler, Yazdijerd III, was killed, and centralized Iranian kingship came to an end. This political collapse has direct and far-reaching consequences for Zoroastrianism. For more than 4 centuries, the religion has functioned as a state-supported system embedded in imperial law, administration, and social hierarchy. With the disappearance of the Sasanian state, this institutional framework collapses. Zoroastrianism loses its legal privilege, its role in governance, and its connection to imperial authority. What ends in 651 AD is not the religion itself, but its status as a state religion. The Arab conquests do not immediately dismantle local religious life. Early Islamic administration prioritized political control and revenue collection rather than religious uniformity. Zoroastrian communities, like Jewish and Christian communities, are incorporated into the new order as protected but subordinate groups. They retain the right to practice their religion in exchange for loyalty and the payment of specific taxes. This arrangement reflects pragmatic governance rather than ideological tolerance. However, the loss of state support fundamentally alters the balance of power. Zoroastrian priests no longer operate within a legal system that enforces religious norms. Fire temples lose state patronage, land endowments, and official protection. The centralized priestly hierarchy established under the Sasanians is in fragments. Authority reverts to local leaders and community structures, echoing earlier periods of decentralization but under markedly different conditions. The shift in political authority also changes patterns of conversion. Conversion to Islam is not initially forced on the population. Over time, however, economic incentives, social mobility, and administrative advantage encourage gradual conversion among Iranian populations. Zoroastrians who convert are exempt from certain taxes and gain access to positions within the new ruling system. These pressures operate unevenly across regions and centuries, producing a slow but steady demographic decline rather than an abrupt disappearance. The legal status of Zoroastrians under early Islamic rule is not uniform. In some regions, Zoroastrians are treated alongside Jews and Christians as communities possessing recognized religious traditions. In others, their status is more ambiguous, reflecting debates within Islamic jurisprudence about how to classify them. Despite this ambiguity, Zoroastrian practice continues across Iran during the centuries immediately following the conquest. The material consequences of the collapse of state support are substantial. Large temple complexes fall into disuse or are repurposed. Priestly education becomes more limited as resources shrink. Ritual practice continues, but often in reduced or simplified forms adapted to local circumstances. Communities rely increasingly on inherited memory rather than institutional infrastructure. Textual transmission is also affected. Under the Sasanians, efforts to collect and organize sacred material benefited from imperial patronage. After 651 AD, these efforts became community-based. Middle Persian, or Pahlavi, emerges as a key medium for preserving religious knowledge. Texts composed or redacted in the centuries following the conquest reflect both earlier tradition and the new realities of minority status. They preserve doctrine, ritual instruction, and historical memory under conditions of constraint. The relationship between religion and identity changes during this period. Under the Sasanians, Zoroastrianism functions as a marker of imperial legitimacy and social order. After the fall of the empire, it became increasingly associated with communal identity rather than political power. Religious practice is sustained within families and local communities rather than through state institutions. This shift marks a fundamental reorientation in how the religion functions in society. Regional variation increases further. In some areas, particularly in western Iran and Mesopotamia, conversion proceeds relatively quickly due to proximity to administrative centers and trade routes. In other regions, including parts of central and eastern Iran, Zoroastrian communities remain numerous for longer periods. The pace of change depends on local conditions rather than centralized policy. It is important to avoid portraying this period as one of immediate collapse or uniform persecution. The historical record does not support such a view. Instead, it indicates a gradual transformation marked by adaptation, negotiation, and long-term demographic change. Zoroastrianism survives not because it retains institutional power, but because it adapts to a new political environment. By the end of the 7th century AD, the outlines of this transformation are clear. Zoroastrianism no longer shapes law, kingship, or imperial ideology. It continues as a living religious tradition practiced by communities dispersed across the Iranian world. The end of state support represents a decisive break in the religion's history, comparable in scale to the Gathic reform or the Sasanian institutionalization. This period establishes the conditions under which Zoroastrianism will persist for centuries as a minority religion. The strategies developed in response to the loss of empire, local organization, textual preservation, and selective adaptation will shape the religion's future trajectory. In the decades following the collapse of the Sasanian state in 651 AD, Iranian society underwent a prolonged process of political, social, and cultural reorganization under Islamic rule. This process does not unfold uniformly, nor does it produce immediate religious homogeneity. Zoroastrianism enters a new phase defined by minority status, legal negotiation, and long-term demographic change. The period from the 7th to the 10th centuries AD is decisive in shaping how the religion survives without an empire. Early Islamic governance in former Sasanian territories prioritizes administrative continuity and fiscal stability. Many existing bureaucratic structures are retained, particularly in taxation and land management. Iranian administrators continue to serve in local and regional offices, especially during the Umayyad and early Abbasid periods. This continuity moderates the immediate impact of conquest on daily life and allows non-Muslim communities, including Zoroastrians, to persist within the new political order. Zoroastrians are incorporated into the Islamic State as non-Muslim subjects with protected but subordinate status. While Islamic legal classifications vary, Zoroastrians are generally treated in practice alongside other non-Muslim religious communities. They are permitted to maintain places of worship, conduct rituals, and regulate internal communal affairs. In return, they are subject to additional taxes, most notably the jizya, and excluded from certain positions of political and military authority. This legal arrangement reshapes the social position of Zoroastrian communities. The loss of exemption from taxation and the imposition of fiscal burdens create material pressure. Conversion to Islam offers clear economic and administrative advantages, including tax relief and access to state institutions. Over time, these incentives contribute to gradual conversion, particularly among urban populations and elites seeking integration into the new ruling structure. The pace of conversion is uneven and extended over several centuries. There is no evidence for empire-wide forced conversion during this period. Instead, demographic change results from cumulative social, economic, and political factors. In rural areas and regions distant from administrative centers, Zoroastrian communities persist in larger numbers for longer periods. Urban centers, by contrast, experience faster religious change due to closer interaction with Islamic institutions. The decline of Zoroastrian institutional infrastructure accelerates during this period. Fire temples that once benefited from Sasanian patronage lose land endowments and official protection. Some are abandoned. Others continue to function at a reduced scale, supported by local communities rather than the state. Priestly networks contract as resources diminish, limiting formal training and ritual specialization. Despite these constraints, religious life continues. Ritual practice adapts to local conditions, often becoming more domestic and community-centered. Major rites associated with purity, prayer, and seasonal observance persist, though sometimes in simplified forms. The absence of centralized enforcement allows for variation, but it also enables the flexibility necessary for survival. Textual preservation becomes a central concern. During the early Islamic centuries, Zoroastrian scholars and priests increasingly relied on Middle Persian or Pahlavi as a written medium. While the Avesta itself remains primarily a liturgical language preserved through memorization, explanatory texts, legal discussions, and theological reflections are recorded in Pahlavi. These writings include commentaries, ritual manuals, and historical recollections that preserve knowledge threatened by demographic decline. The composition and redaction of Pahlavi literature during this period reflect both continuity and change. These texts draw on earlier Sasanian tradition but are shaped by new circumstances. They address questions of law, ritual practice, and identity relevant to minority communities operating under Islamic rule. They also preserve idealized memories of the Sasanian past, emphasizing the former alignment between religion and kingship. The relationship between Zoroastrianism and Islamic culture during this period is complex. Iranian intellectual life increasingly operates in Arabic, the language of administration, scholarship, and theology. Zoroastrians participate indirectly in this environment, contributing to scientific, medical, and philosophical traditions through translation and collaboration. At the same time, religious boundaries remain distinct. Zoroastrian doctrine and ritual are maintained internally, while engagement with Islamic thought is selective and pragmatic. Legal debates within Islamic jurisprudence affect Zoroastrian communities in varying ways. Scholars differ on how to classify Zoroastrians within Islamic law, leading to regional variation in their treatment. In some areas, Zoroastrians enjoy relatively stable protection. In others, restrictions intensify. These differences reflect local politics and jurisprudential interpretation rather than a uniform policy. Geographically, the distribution of Zoroastrian populations changes significantly during this period. Communities retreat from major urban centers and concentrate in specific regions, including parts of central Iran. This consolidation reduces visibility but enhances communal cohesion. Local networks of kinship and ritual support become increasingly important. By the 9th and 10th centuries AD, the cumulative effects of conversion, migration, and economic pressure are evident. Zoroastrians represent a shrinking proportion of the population, and their influence on public life is limited. Nevertheless, the religion persists as a coherent tradition. Core rituals, ethical concepts, and cosmological frameworks remain intact, transmitted through family lines and priestly instruction. This period marks a decisive shift in the function of Zoroastrianism. It no longer operates as a public religion tied to law and governance. Instead, it becomes a community-based tradition focused on preservation rather than expansion. The strategies developed during these centuries, textual codification, ritual adaptation, and communal solidarity, ensure continuity under conditions of reduced power. The end of the 10th century AD does not represent a conclusion, but a transition. Zoroastrian communities that endure beyond this point do so within a changing Islamic world marked by regional dynasties, economic shifts, and cultural exchange. Some communities will remain in Iran, while others will seek stability beyond it. Between the 8th and the 16th centuries AD, Zoroastrian history enters a phase defined not by imperial rule or territorial dominance, but by migration, adaptation, and long-term preservation under minority conditions. This period does not mark a single event or unified movement. Instead, it reflects a gradual process through which Zoroastrian communities relocate from Iran to the western coast of the Indian subcontinent, while other communities remain in Iran under changing political circumstances. Together, these developments reshape the geographic and social structure of Zoroastrianism without altering its core religious identity. From the 7th to the 10th centuries AD, Zoroastrians in Iran experienced sustained demographic decline driven by conversion, economic pressure, and reduced institutional support. Although the religion survives in several regions, its practitioners become increasingly concentrated and socially marginal. These pressures do not produce immediate mass migration, but they create incentives for relocation over time, particularly for communities with access to maritime trade networks. Traditional accounts of Zoroastrian migration to India are preserved in later sources, most notably the Kisai Sunjun, composed in the late medieval period. This text describes the arrival of Zoroastrian refugees on the western coast of India, their negotiations with local rulers, and their establishment of permanent settlements. While the narrative provides valuable insight into communal memory and identity, it was written centuries after the events it describes. Its details cannot be treated as contemporaneous historical reporting. Modern scholarship, therefore, treats these accounts as partially symbolic, requiring cautious correlation with external evidence. What can be stated with confidence is that Zoroastrian migration to India occurs gradually, beginning no later than the early 2nd millennium AD and possibly earlier. Small groups arrive by sea along established trade routes connecting the Persian Gulf with the western Indian coast. These routes had been active for centuries, facilitating the movement of goods, people, and ideas between Iran, Arabia, and South Asia. Migration unfolds over generations rather than as a single flight. The primary destination for these migrants is the region of Gujarat. This area offers several advantages: access to maritime commerce, relative political stability, and a social environment in which religious minorities can negotiate space within existing structures. Local rulers grant Zoroastrian settlers permission to reside and practice their religion under specific conditions. These arrangements reflect pragmatic governance rather than religious alignment. In India, Zoroastrian migrants became known as Parsis, a term derived from Parsi, meaning Persian. This designation reflects geographic origin rather than doctrinal difference. The Parsis do not represent a new religion or sect. They preserve Zoroastrian ritual, theology, and communal organization while adapting linguistically and socially to their new environment. One of the most significant developments during this period is the stabilization of Zoroastrian religious life in India. In contrast to the declining institutional infrastructure in Iran, Parsi communities can support temples, priestly training, and communal organization. Fire temples are established as formal centers of worship. While these institutions reflect Sasanian-era precedents, they operate independently of state sponsorship and rely entirely on community support. Ritual continuity remains a central priority. Core practices involving purity, prayer, and ceremonial observance are preserved with care. The Avesta continues to be transmitted liturgically, while Middle Persian texts and later translations support instruction and interpretation. Over time, Gujarati becomes the primary spoken language of the Parsis, but religious texts remain anchored in Avestan and Pahlavi traditions. Social adaptation accompanies religious preservation. Parsi communities integrate into the economic life of Western India, engaging in trade, craftsmanship, and later administration. They adopt local dress, cuisine, and language while maintaining distinct religious boundaries. Endogamy becomes an important mechanism for preserving communal identity, reinforcing continuity across generations. Meanwhile, Zoroastrian communities that remain in Iran continue to experience marginalization under successive Islamic dynasties. Their numbers decline, and their public visibility diminishes. By the later medieval period, most Iranian Zoroastrians were concentrated in specific regions, particularly in central Iran. Interaction between Iranian and Indian Zoroastrians during this period is limited but significant. Occasional correspondence and priestly exchange occur, particularly regarding ritual questions and calendar calculation. These interactions reinforce a shared religious identity despite geographic separation. They also reveal differences that emerge over time, shaped by local conditions rather than doctrinal divergence. From the 13th to the 16th centuries AD, political and economic changes in India further affected Parsi communities. Shifts in regional power, expansion of trade networks, and later the arrival of European merchants alter the social landscape. Parsis adapt to these changes, leveraging literacy, commercial expertise, and communal cohesion. Their minority status does not prevent participation in broader society. Instead, it shapes a strategy of selective engagement. It is important to note that this period does not represent a uniform experience across all Zoroastrians. While Parsi communities achieve relative stability and growth in India, Iranian Zoroastrians face continued challenges. The divergence between these experiences produces differences in social organization and external engagement, but not in core religious doctrine. Both communities continue to identify themselves as adherents of the same religious tradition. By the end of the medieval period, Zoroastrianism existed in two primary geographic centers: a small but resilient population in Iran and a growing, economically integrated community in Western India. Neither community possesses political power or territorial control. Both function as minority traditions sustained through internal organization rather than external authority. This period demonstrates a central theme in the long history of Zoroastrianism: survival through adaptation without doctrinal rupture. Migration to India does not alter the religion's foundational principles. Instead, it provides a new setting in which those principles can be maintained under conditions more favorable than those prevailing in Iran at the time. The developments of these centuries set the stage for the modern era. Changes in global trade, colonial expansion, and later modern nation-states will further reshape Zoroastrian communities. From the early modern period onward, Zoroastrianism enters a phase defined by survival without territorial power, adaptation to new political orders, and increasing geographic dispersion. The religion no longer operates within an imperial framework and does not regain state sponsorship. Instead, it persists through community institutions, inherited ritual practice, and controlled transmission of doctrine. The period from roughly 1600 AD to the present is marked by divergent experiences in Iran and India, followed by the emergence of a global diaspora. In Iran, the Safavid dynasty established Shia Islam as the state religion in the early 16th century AD, reshaping the legal and social environment for all religious minorities. Zoroastrians continue to live primarily in central Iran, especially in regions such as Yazd and Kerman. Their legal status fluctuates across reigns. At times, they face increased restrictions, economic burdens, and social segregation. At other times, local arrangements provide relative stability. Throughout this period, Zoroastrians remained excluded from political authority and depended on communal organization for religious continuity. Religious life in Iran during the early modern period remains largely domestic and community-centered. Fire temples operate on a small scale, supported by local families rather than endowments. Priestly training is maintained through apprenticeship and oral instruction. Avestan liturgy continues to be memorized and recited, while Middle Persian texts preserve legal and ritual knowledge. Despite limited resources, continuity is maintained through careful transmission rather than institutional expansion. In contrast, Zoroastrian communities in Western India experience a different trajectory. By the 17th century AD, the Parsis were firmly established along the Gujarat coast and in nearby urban centers. Their position within Indian society allows greater economic participation than is possible for their co-religionists in Iran. Trade, craftsmanship, and later involvement in administration provide financial stability that supports communal institutions. The arrival of European colonial powers, particularly the British, introduces new conditions. During the 18th and 19th centuries AD, Parsis became prominent in commerce, industry, and education within colonial India. This prominence does not derive from religious privilege, but from strategic engagement with emerging economic systems. Parsi philanthropy supports schools, hospitals, and religious institutions, reinforcing communal cohesion. Fire temples in India developed into stable, well-maintained institutions during this period. Priestly lineages are supported, ritual standards are preserved, and communal records become more systematic. While these institutions reflect Sasanian-era precedents, they operate entirely without state sponsorship. Authority rests in communal consensus rather than legal enforcement. The 19th century AD marks a turning point in Zoroastrian intellectual life. Increased contact with European scholarship leads to the study of the Avestan language through comparative philology. Western academic interest in Zoroastrian texts contributes to new editions, translations, and historical analysis. Zoroastrians themselves engage with these developments, producing reform movements and internal debates concerning education, ritual practice, and social norms. One area of debate concerns communal boundaries. Questions of conversion, intermarriage, and membership become increasingly prominent as Zoroastrians interact with broader societies. Different communities adopt different positions, reflecting local conditions rather than centralized doctrine. These debates illustrate the absence of a single authoritative body capable of resolving such issues across the global community. The late 19th and early 20th centuries AD witnessed further transformation. Political change in Iran, including the decline of dynastic rule and the emergence of modern nation-state structures, alters the legal position of Zoroastrians. Reforms gradually improve civil status, granting greater legal equality, though social marginalization persists. In India, the end of colonial rule and the partition of the subcontinent reshaped economic and political conditions, prompting migration. From the late 19th century onward, Zoroastrian communities began to establish themselves beyond Iran and India. Migration to Britain, North America, East Africa, and later Australia accelerates in the 20th century AD. These movements create a global diaspora. Zoroastrianism becomes a transnational religion sustained through networks rather than concentrated populations. Diaspora communities face new challenges. Small population size, geographic dispersion, and intermarriage place pressure on traditional mechanisms of transmission. In response, communities establish associations, cultural centers, and educational programs to maintain identity. Fire temples are built in major diaspora centers, often modeled on Indian precedents. Ritual practice is preserved, though adapted to local conditions. Demographically, Zoroastrian populations decline in relative and absolute terms during the modern period. Low birth rates, immigration, and strict membership criteria contribute to shrinking numbers, particularly in India. Iranian Zoroastrian communities remain small but continuous. These trends prompt renewed discussion about sustainability and identity. Despite demographic challenges, Zoroastrianism maintains doctrinal continuity. Core concepts, reverence for Ahura Mazda, commitment to truth and order, ritual purity, and ethical responsibility remain intact. The religion does not fragment into competing sections. Variation exists in practice and communal policy, but foundational theology remains consistent with earlier tradition. In the contemporary period, Zoroastrianism functions without political authority, territorial control, or state enforcement. Its institutions rely entirely on voluntary participation, philanthropy, and communal consensus. Religious education combines traditional instruction with modern scholarship. Texts are studied both as liturgical material and as historical documents. Zoroastrian communities engage increasingly with global discourse on religious heritage, minority rights, and cultural preservation. International organizations coordinate events, scholarships, and advocacy. These efforts reflect a modern context rather than a transformation of belief. By the early 21st century AD, Zoroastrianism exists as a global minority religion with deep historical roots and limited numbers. Its survival over more than 3 millennia rests not on political power, but on adaptability, continuity of ritual, and controlled transmission of tradition. The religion has endured empire, conquest, migration, and modernization without abandoning its core structure. Across more than 3 millennia, the history of Zoroastrianism unfolds not as a linear rise and decline, but as a sequence of structural transformations shaped by changing relationships between belief, community, and political power. From its emergence within an Indo-Iranian religious environment to its present existence as a global minority tradition, Zoroastrianism demonstrates continuity without stasis and survival without sovereignty. The earliest phase, reconstructed through comparative linguistics and ritual history, situates Zoroastrianism within a broader Indo-Iranian world defined by polytheistic practice, ritual sacrifice, and decentralized authority. This environment provides the vocabulary and assumptions that Zarathustra's teachings engage and reconfigure. The Gathic reform does not abolish inherited tradition, it reorders it. Cosmic order becomes ethical order. Ritual is subordinated to truth. Authority shifts from inherited status to alignment with Asha. At this stage, Zoroastrianism exists not as an institution, but as a reformist orientation circulating orally among small communities. The centuries that follow establish a pattern that recurs throughout the religion's history: transmission without canon, diversity without schism, and continuity without centralized enforcement. Early Zoroastrianism spreads through kinship networks and local ritual practice, adapting to regional conditions. Variation is structural, not deviant. No mechanism exists to define orthodoxy, and none is required for survival. The encounter with the empire begins cautiously. Under the Achaemenids, Mazdian concepts enter royal ideology, but they do not crystallize into a state religion. Ahura Mazda is invoked as a source of legitimacy, yet religious pluralism remains intact. This limited association between belief and power establishes precedent without institutionalization. Zoroastrianism gains visibility but not control. Imperial collapse reverses even this modest elevation. The Hellenistic period and Seleucid rule removed Iranian religious concepts from state representation entirely. Zoroastrian traditions persist through local practice, but fragmentation increases. The Parthian period normalizes decentralization. Iranian rule returns without religious consolidation. Zoroastrianism survives as a family of related traditions embedded in a pluralistic religious landscape. The decisive transformation occurs under the Sasanians. For the first and only time, Zoroastrianism becomes a centralized state religion. Priesthood, law, ritual, and doctrine are organized in alignment with imperial authority. Textual consolidation, temple networks, and hierarchical structures take shape. This period defines what later sources often present as classical Zoroastrianism. Yet this consolidation is historically contingent. It depends on imperial power and legal enforcement. Its strength is inseparable from its vulnerability. The fall of the Sasanian Empire in 651 AD marks the end of state Zoroastrianism, not the end of the religion. The loss of political backing dismantles institutions built around imperial authority. What follows is a long phase of adaptation under Islamic rule. Zoroastrianism becomes a minority tradition sustained through community organization, ritual memory, and textual preservation. Conversion occurs gradually, driven by social and economic pressures rather than immediate coercion. Survival depends on flexibility rather than dominance. Migration introduces a new axis of continuity. The movement of Zoroastrian communities to the Indian subcontinent does not create a new religion, it creates a new setting. Parsi communities preserve ritual and doctrine while adapting socially and linguistically. In India, Zoroastrianism stabilizes institutionally without state sponsorship. In Iran, smaller communities persist under constraint. The religion's geographic center of gravity shifts, but its theological core remains intact. The modern period extends this pattern. Zoroastrianism enters a global context shaped by colonialism, nation-states, and diaspora. It operates without territorial control, legal privilege, or political authority. Institutions rely on voluntary participation and philanthropy. Demographic decline presents challenges, but doctrinal fragmentation does not occur. Variation in communal policy reflects circumstance rather than schism. Across all phases, several structural constants emerge. Zoroastrianism repeatedly demonstrates the capacity to function without centralized enforcement. Its core concepts, truth, order, ethical responsibility, and ritual purity, prove transferable across political systems. Institutional forms rise and fall, but the religion does not depend exclusively on any single structure for survival. Equally important are the limits revealed by history. When aligned too closely with state power, Zoroastrianism gains coherence, but risks collapse with the state itself. When operating without power, it loses scale but gains resilience. This tension defines its historical trajectory. From a global historical perspective, Zoroastrianism occupies a distinct position. It is neither a missionary religion nor a territorial faith. Its influence extends beyond its numbers through concepts that shape Iranian culture and, indirectly, broader religious thought. Yet its own continuity rests on inward transmission rather than expansion. By the present day, Zoroastrianism stands as one of the world's oldest continuously practiced religions. Its history does not conclude with empire, conquest, or migration. It continues as a living tradition sustained by communities that inherit, adapt, and transmit belief without sovereignty. This continuity, maintained across more than 3,000 years, defines the historical significance of Zoroastrianism more than any single period of power or decline. This synthesis closes the documentary narrative by situating Zoroastrianism within long-duration history, a religion shaped by reform, transformed by empire, preserved through minority existence, and sustained into the modern world through adaptability rather than authority.